that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
I think we never tire of hearing these things. That speech is something almost akin to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. I never tire of hearing that either. Lincoln, a man for all times? I ask you that question. Is there one amongst us who does not have a fascination for Abraham Lincoln? To read his story is to learn about how hard life was for ordinary people. As you may know, Lincoln was born in the tiniest of cabins in the woods of Kentucky on February 12, 1809. When he was 8 years old, they moved to the slave-free state of Indiana, mostly because Tom and Nancy Lincoln despised the institution of slavery. Here they built a larger cabin, 18 by 20. 2 years later, Abe and Sarah's mother died. Abe was 10 years old and Sarah 12. Tom remarried a widow, also named Sarah, with 3 children. She brought order, energy, and affection to the family. Abe got 1 year of very basic education, but enough to set him on the road to being an avid reader. Abe's stepmother admired the mind of young Abe, feeling he was like her. She said he was a good child who was never cross. He never told me a lie in his life. He treated everybody kindly and was the best boy I ever expected to see. He cared nothing for clothes. He was witty and sad and thoughtful by turns. From the beginning, he had a remarkable mind. Young Abe read books while others played. He read anything he could get his hands on. Family and friends remember him lying down with his long legs up a tree. He'd lie on the ground with his legs up. He copied into a notebook what he wanted to remember. If there were no paper, he'd write on wooden boards. Each day, he'd commit to memory or treasure up, as he said, what he'd learned. He confessed to a friend that he was a very slow reader, but once he'd taken in the information, he was slow to forget it. I was struck by how comfortable he was with himself and his style of learning. He loved poetry, Shakespeare, history, the Bible, and he carried a volume of Euclid with him when he traveled. He was quite a mathematician. He committed large tracts of poetry to memory. In those days, the only entertainment was itinerant preachers and politicians. Wonder which you would choose to go to. Abe would entertain the other children by giving speeches and mimicking the preachers. He made up stories and jokes and was generally great fun. He would do this all his life, helping himself to get through severe bouts of depression or melancholy, as they called it then. That was quite remarkable to me, that he made up jokes to cheer up himself. I cannot help wondering what it would be like to live without television to distract us. Would we be more comfortable with ourselves? Would we be more widely read and deeper thinkers? Lincoln grew to a striking 6'4", rather like our gentleman this morning, which was most unusual then. He was plain-faced, with unruly hair, and most people, even little children, commented on how sad he looked. You might know, well, we heard in the story this morning that a little girl wrote to him, and he actually wrote back, and it's true, it happened. I thought our Lincoln likeness today looked pretty good, didn't you? But we covered our bases, with beard and without beard. When the Lincoln sisters and brothers began to be married, the whole family moved to New Salem, Illinois, in 1831. Abe was 21 years old. He began a series of jobs working in general stores, plowing fields, harvesting, fixing fences, and in his spare time, he studied law. People must have had great confidence in the young man, for Abe was hired as a surveyor and quickly learned how to do this. He was also hired as postmaster. He particularly liked this because he could do what he loved the best, read. He read newspapers from all around the country and got to know everything about politics in the country. He didn't just read the newspapers, he read them out loud. When he later shared a law office with William Herndon, this reading out loud was a major distraction for William, who later also became a prolific Lincoln biographer. When he asked Abe why he did this, he replied that it helped him remember it all so that he didn't have to write it down. If we want to keep our relationships, we might not want to emulate this. I must say, in my older age, I read more things out. You know, if something's beautiful, or if I'm reading a book, or whatever it is, I read it out loud, not to anybody, but just to hear the words spoken. Or maybe I'm just going potty. The jobs of surveyor and postmaster were to support him for many years. Politicians would come through the town and speak and debate on street corners. Abe would enter into the debate. At the age of 23, in 1932, he entered the race for state representative of Illinois. He won his own area, but lost the race. In fact, all but 2 people in his local area who knew him voted for him. I think there were only about 568 people in his area, and 566 voted for him. He realized he had to get to know a lot more people if he wanted to win a political race. So with his knack for getting along with working people, telling jokes and stories while talking to them about politics, he was easily elected 2 years later. His language was plain and clear. For the first time, he had a suit made for him that wasn't 3 inches higher than his ankles. He was the Illinois Assembly's tallest lawmaker. And it does say in some of the books that people used to wonder, why does he wear such a tall hat? And it was because he kept notes in there. Or perhaps he just liked the fashion. Abolitionists had forced the entire country to confront the issue of slavery and had brought strong reactions and sometimes violence upon themselves from the mobs. These times began to feel to me like our times. Abe had inherited from his parents an abhorrence of slavery. As a young man, he said, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. In March 1837, he crafted a clever resolution expressing that allowing slavery in their state of Illinois would be immoral. This was his first public stand. He also believed and called for voting rights for all who paid taxes, including women. So he was way ahead of his time. Abe was a born leader. He led, others followed. However, Springfield was still a small, rough frontier town. Lincoln used to tell the story of a preacher who applied for permission to give a series of lectures at the State House. When asked what the subject of the lectures would be, the preacher said, "They are on the second coming of our Lord." The Secretary of State responded, "If you will take my advice, you will not waste your time in this city. It is my private opinion that if the Lord has been to Springfield once, he will not come a second time." That's Abe Lincoln's joke. Abe was accused of being godless. You probably know that Lincoln did not belong to an organized religion, but he responded to such accusations that he had a very deep faith. He frequently quoted this couplet: "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we will." The more he said, the more I thought he would fit right into a UU setting. He said, "There are no accidents in my philosophy. Every effect must have its cause. The past is the cause of the present, and the present will be the cause of the future. All these are the links in the endless chain, stretching from the finite to the infinite." He seemed to think there is such a thing as destiny, but choice is there as well. The run for the presidency in 1860 took him across the country, where he found Northerners, especially in Massachusetts, particularly appreciative of his speeches. In New York, he was fascinated by Niagara Falls and mused at the mysterious power that mighty roaring tumult. He said that it called to his mind when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, when Adam first came from the hand of his maker. Then, as now, Niagara was roaring here. There's little doubt in my mind but that Lincoln was a deeply spiritual person. He was thought to be homely looking. When he was accused of being two-faced, he quipped, "If I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one?" Though he had a few relationships with women, none had worked out. It was in Springfield where Abe was introduced to Mary Todd. They made plans to be engaged, even though most of their friends and Mary's family counseled against the match. Mary was 5'2", chubby, passionate, and loved to dance. Abe was 6'4", thin, totally not passionate, and couldn't dance. Mary was known as a violent little Whig, totally devoted to the Whig Party, and that attracted him. But suddenly, Lincoln became enamored of a pretty 18-year-old girl and broke off the relationship with Mary. However, he suffered a great crisis of conscience over breaking his word, that he fell into a depression, that his friends were worried for his life. He did recover, and Mary and Abe were actually alike, he discovered, in important ways. They were both highly intelligent, witty, had excellent memories, and were voracious readers. And they shared a love of Robert Burns' poetry, though I think my Scottish grandfather would have said Rabbie Burns. And could they really get their tongues around the Scottish sayings? Finally, Abe decided to marry Mary if she'd have him back. He was greatly relieved when she said yes. He was greatly relieved to be right with his conscience. Mary had always told her friends that she would marry a man who would be president. They were surprisingly happy, especially in the early years when the children were born. Abe was a devoted father, but distracted. A neighbor reported that Mr. Lincoln had his little children in a wagon that he pulled behind him while reading a book. When she brought this to his attention, that one of the babies had fallen out of the cart, he walked back, picked up the child, put him back in the cart, and then resumed his walk and his reading. Nevertheless, he loved and enjoyed the children and never ever disciplined them. Mary said he was the tenderest and kindest father imaginable. Later, Mary would prove to be a most excellent president's wife, sparkling in all social activities, although she always hankered after the days when she had slaves to do most of the household work. Oh yes, the Todd family had slaves, but there were no slaves in the Lincoln home or in their White House. In later years, Abe spent most of his time away from home. When he came home at weekends, Mary's temperament drove him away again, but also set him free to do his political work and become known across the country. Psychologists surmise that Mary suffered migraine headaches, which were little understood in those days. Between his stints in Congress, Abe turned to law and rode the circuit, with the circuit judge, covering hundreds of miles on horseback and serving the people wherever they went. I think they didn't earn very much money in those days from their political position. He was a brilliant trial lawyer, relying exclusively on his logic for justice without regard to precedent or the law books. Juries always decided in favor of his client. Lincoln's political party was the Whigs. They believed everything that he did, which is, government ought to exist to support development while shaping the economy and society. They believed in an internal improvement situation, or public works, a national bank, and a high protective town. Barack Obama also cited these beliefs during his campaign, I remember that, in an attempt to persuade us that government must take on an active role, especially in times of crisis. The Whigs were also against slavery, but adhered to the plan of having the government buy the slaves from their owners and repatriating them to Liberia, so as not to align themselves with the abolitionists, which would have meant political suicide. The Democrats of their day believed in an idyllic nation of small farmers and shops and as little government as possible. The Whigs were later to be called the New Republicans. These names and what they stood for are all very interesting today, since the Republicans and Democrats were to switch their identification 100 years later. Abraham was convinced that he was to be president and to end slavery, though it would likely cost him his life. Embracing this inner knowledge, he steeped himself in every possible argument for slavery. Then he set about presenting every possible argument against slavery. His arguments were so very persuasive that many became convinced that slavery is indeed immoral. He was elected, and from day one, the whole of his tenure was taken up with the Civil War. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Lincoln was the team he selected for his cabinet. Historians have called it a team of rivals. Hours after hearing he was elected, Abraham sat down and listed the men he wanted. Most were rivals that ran against him for the presidential nomination. He absolutely didn't want yes men, unlike someone who was recently president. He wanted a team of able men who would challenge him. Some of them hated him, and some of those came to love him. He listened to every one of them so carefully, hearing deeply their thoughts on all issues and decisions. It may have been the most remarkable cabinet in presidential history. Entirely is my opinion. Just as Lincoln had a premonition that he would be president, he later had a premonition, a dream, that the president had been assassinated. When he told his wife, she said he should put it out of his mind and go to the theatre. They loved to do that. That was one of their greatest joys, going to the theatre. That was the night that Lincoln gave his security guard the night off. On April 14, 1865, which was Good Friday, John Wilkes Booth and an unbalanced actor shot Lincoln to death in his theatre box and leaped to the stage and escaped. It was a senseless death for so great a man. The nation was greatly grieved, especially on a day such that gave a sense of a life being sacrificed or martyred. He gave us so much in terms of his character. We Unitarian Universalists are fond of saying that for us, salvation is by character. We might say that Lincoln led the way to good character. He was an exemplar, a character that lacked malice, even towards those who opposed everything he believed in. He knew only truth and righteousness, without prejudgment, and he lived his life for others. He once said to his colleague, William Herndon, "How hard, oh how hard it is to die and leave one's country, no better for the life of him that lived and died." He need not have worried, for he left us so much better off for his having lived. Perhaps we can carry on all that he began. Is he a man for all times? I believe he is. May we honor the fine qualities of our exemplars by modeling them in our own lives, and perhaps, like Lincoln, leave the country better for ours.